Welcome to Shadows of Black History. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is right now. I truly love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. If you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe and like this channel. Your support keeps these powerful stories alive. Stay with me until the very end, because tonight's story will make you question everything you think you know about power and silence. Relax, remove distractions, and listen carefully, because in 1856, at Thornhill Plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, 10 members of a powerful white family died slowly over 7 months from what doctors called a mysterious disease. What no one suspected was that the plantation blacksmith had been planning something far more patient than rage. Before we continue, this story is presented as historical fiction inspired by the brutal realities of slavery in the United States during the 1800s. Certain characters and events are dramatized for narrative purposes. Thornhill Plantation stood wide and proud along the Mississippi River, its white columns visible from the road long before visitors reached the main gate. The owner, Samuel Carter, believed order was the foundation of survival. He believed obedience could be forced, respect could be beaten into existence, and fear was the most reliable tool a master could possess. Among the enslaved men who worked his land was Elijah, the plantation blacksmith. Elijah was tall, steady, and quiet. He worked near the forge where iron glowed red beneath hammer strikes. He repaired tools, shaped horseshoes, and mended broken farm equipment. Carter valued him not as a man, but as an investment. Strong hands meant profit. Skill meant efficiency. Elijah rarely spoke beyond what was necessary. People mistook his silence for submission. They did not know silence can hide careful thought. Elijah's father had been brought from West Africa years before him. Though chains tried to erase memory, some knowledge survived. His father had once worked with metals long before arriving in Mississippi. He taught Elijah something important while they labored at separate forges. Metal remembers fire. Metal changes under heat, and some metals carry danger when handled without understanding. His father never explained fully. He never dared, but he spoke in warnings, in stories, in quiet lessons about patience. After his father died from exhaustion in the cane fields, Elijah carried those lessons alone. He did not yet know how they would shape his future. He only knew that knowledge was the only inheritance slavery could not easily steal. Everything changed when Samuel Carter decided to make a public example of obedience. Carter's overseer had a daughter who suffered from a condition that made her smaller than other women her age. The plantation mocked her quietly. Carter saw opportunity in humiliation. To demonstrate complete control over Elijah, he ordered him into a forced marriage with the overseer's daughter during a Sunday gathering in front of enslaved workers and white guests. It was not about love. It was not about companionship. It was about dominance. Elijah was dressed in borrowed clothes and forced to stand before the crowd, while Carter announced the union as proof that the plantation master controlled every detail of his property's life. Laughter rippled through white guests. Some enslaved workers lowered their heads in shame. Elijah stood still, his face unreadable. That day, something shifted inside him, not loudly, not violently, but permanently. In the weeks that followed, Thornhill Plantation continued its routines. Cotton fields were harvested, horses were shod, tools were repaired. But inside the Carter household, subtle changes began. The master complained of fatigue that would not fade, His wife experienced strange stomach pains after evening meals. A visiting cousin fell ill and returned home weakened. Doctors were summoned repeatedly. They examined water sources. They blamed swamp air. They blamed seasonal fever. They prescribed tonics and rest. But the illness did not behave like ordinary sickness. It lingered. It returned. It moved from one family member to another in quiet sequence. Servants whispered that something unseen had entered the house. Samuel Carter grew impatient, then afraid. Elijah continued working at the forge each day, hammer striking iron in steady rhythm. He repaired silverware when it bent. He polished serving trays when they dulled. He reshaped metal fittings for dining tables. He was trusted inside the main house more than most enslaved men because his skill was necessary. No one questioned the blacksmith when he carried utensils back to the forge for repair. No one imagined that knowledge passed from father to son could become something far more dangerous than open rebellion. Over 7 long months, one by one, members of the Carter household weakened. 10 deaths were recorded in plantation logs. Doctors shook their heads, calling it unfortunate disease. Ministers prayed over coffins. Carter himself grew pale and thin, his temper fading into fear. He began suspecting the swamp, the air, even the kitchen staff. He never once suspected the man whose hammer echoed calmly each morning. By the time the 10th burial took place, Thornhill Plantation no longer felt powerful. It felt cursed. White neighbors stopped visiting. Carter's surviving relatives argued over inheritance. Servants moved through halls more quietly than before. Elijah stood near the forge watching smoke rise into the Mississippi sky. He had not shouted. He had not gathered weapons. He had not led a revolt. Yet the foundation of Thornhill had cracked from within. And as rumors spread across Wilkinson County about the mysterious deaths at the Carter estate, one question lingered unspoken. Had the illness truly been accidental? Or had patience proved more powerful than chains? If you would like me to continue with Chapter 2 and escalate the investigation in Paranoia, say continue. By the time the 5th death was recorded in the Carter family ledger, fear had replaced arrogance inside the big house at Thornhill Plantation. What had first been dismissed as seasonal sickness now felt deliberate, though no one dared say the word aloud. Samuel Carter ordered the wells inspected twice. He accused the kitchen staff of negligence. He demanded that meat be tasted before he touched it. Yet, despite every precaution, illness returned in waves. His wife grew weaker each week. A visiting nephew developed strange tremors after dining in the main hall. A house servant collapsed suddenly and never recovered. Doctors from nearby counties were summoned again and again. They argued about swamp fever, about tainted water, about unknown ailments carried by river air. None offered certainty, and certainty was what Carter needed most. Elijah continued his work at the forge without change in expression or rhythm. The ringing of hammer against iron echoed across the yard daily, steady and controlled. To those watching, he appeared unaffected by the tension spreading through the estate. He repaired plows and horseshoes as always. When dining utensils bent or tarnished, they were sent to him for reshaping and polishing. It had always been that way. No one thought twice about it. The Carter family trusted iron and silver more than they trusted the people who served them, yet they placed those same objects regularly in Elijah's hands. Trust born from necessity can be blind, and blindness can be fatal. Inside the house, suspicion began to poison relationships long before any physical weakness finished its work. Carter accused the cook of carelessness. The cook blamed spoiled supplies delivered from town. The overseer whispered that perhaps rival plantation owners had cursed the family. Ministers visited more frequently, offering prayers over sickbeds that seemed permanently occupied. Coffins were built one after another. Each funeral felt heavier than the last. The once lively dining room now echoed with empty chairs. Silverware clinked more softly, as fewer hands gathered around the table. Carter himself began eating alone, fearful even of his remaining relatives. Fear, once used as a weapon against others, had turned inward. Rumors spread beyond Thornhill's gates. Neighboring plantations whispered about the mysterious pattern. 10 deaths in less than a year among one powerful household unsettled everyone. Some called it divine punishment. Others called it misfortune. But no one connected it to the quiet blacksmith, whose role allowed him to move freely between forge and dining room. Elijah's forced marriage, intended as humiliation, had not broken him. It had given him proximity. It had given him access. The overseer's daughter, now bound to him by the master's cruel design, avoided the main house when she could. She sensed something shifting, but did not understand its depth. Elijah spoke little even to her. He kept his thoughts sealed behind steady eyes. One evening, after the 8th death, Samuel Carter stormed into the forge unexpectedly. His face was pale, his movements slower than before. He stared at Elijah for a long moment, as sparks flew under the hammer's strike. "Tell me," Carter demanded, "do you believe in curses?" Elijah paused only briefly, before answering in calm tone. "I believe metal changes under heat, sir." Carter frowned, confused by the response. He muttered something about foolishness and turned away. He did not notice the faintest shift in Elijah's expression after he left. Sometimes, truth hides best inside simplicity. As autumn approached in 1856, Thornhill Plantation felt hollow. The laughter that once drifted from the veranda was gone. Servants moved like shadows. Even the horses seemed restless in their stalls. Carter's own health began failing more severely. His hands trembled when lifting a cup. He accused doctors of incompetence. He accused relatives of bringing sickness into his home. He even accused the overseer quietly of incompetence in managing supplies. Paranoia spread faster than any illness, but through it all, Elijah remained patient. 7 months is a long time when measured in silence. By the time the 10th coffin was lowered into Mississippi soil, Thornhill was no longer feared for its power. It was pitied for its curse. Samuel Carter stood alone near fresh earth, thinner and weaker than ever before. He had wanted obedience displayed publicly. He had wanted humiliation to prove control. Instead, something invisible had dismantled his household piece by piece. He never once suspected that resistance could look like routine, that rebellion could hide behind duty. That knowledge passed quietly, from father to son, could wait for the right moment to surface. And as winter winds began sweeping across Wilkinson County, whispers grew louder. Some said Thornhill had been marked. Others said secrets lingered in the forge, smoke rising each morning, but no one yet understood the full weight of what had happened inside that plantation. And the question remained suspended over Mississippi soil. Was the Carter tragedy truly mysterious disease? Or had someone with steady hands and inherited knowledge rewritten the meaning of resistance without ever raising a weapon? Winter settled over Wilkinson County with a cold that felt sharper than usual. Frost touched the cotton fields. The Mississippi moved slower and darker under gray skies. Thornhill Plantation stood quiet, its once busy veranda nearly empty. Only Samuel Carter remained from the immediate family, who had once filled the house with laughter and commands. He walked with difficulty now, leaning on a cane though he was not yet old. His voice had lost its sharp edge. Fear had hollowed him. He no longer trusted the kitchen. He no longer trusted the well. He barely trusted his own breath. Each morning, he examined his reflection in the mirror, as if expecting to see something unnatural staring back. Illness had stripped him of certainty. Doctors returned again when Carter's strength began fading faster. They examined him carefully and argued in low voices about possible causes. Some blamed a rare fever carried by river insects. Others suggested hereditary weakness. None agreed. None understood why only those who dined regularly in the main hall had suffered most severely. The pattern was visible, yet invisible at the same time. They could not explain why field hands remained healthy, while the master's household collapsed, one member at a time. Carter grew impatient with their uncertainty. He accused them of incompetence and sent for another physician from farther north. That doctor arrived with leather case and heavy confidence, promising answers. Meanwhile, Elijah continued shaping iron in the forge yard. The cold air carried the ring of his hammer farther than usual. To passing eyes, he appeared unchanged. He repaired tools, tightened wagon wheels, and occasionally was summoned into the house to adjust hinges or polish tarnished pieces used for formal dining. Thornhill's routines had not fully stopped. Even in grief, habits persisted, and habits can be predictable. The overseer's daughter, now his forced wife, watched him more closely as the months passed. She sensed that something beneath his quiet exterior was not surrender, but decision. She never spoke of it. She had learned long ago that survival often required silence. The new doctor studied the Carter household carefully. He asked detailed questions about food preparation, water sources, even the storage of utensils. He ordered certain dishes replaced. He demanded cups be scrubbed thoroughly. For a brief moment, Carter felt hope that an answer might finally surface, but days passed, and his condition worsened instead of improving. Tremors increased. Appetite faded. Sleepless nights stretched longer. One evening in frustration, Carter ordered every servant in the house lined up and questioned. Elijah stood among them, face steady, hands calm at his sides. The doctor examined each worker briefly and found nothing suspicious. Frustration turned into desperation. Carter's once booming voice now trembled as he shouted accusations into air that offered no reply. As weeks moved toward the new year, the 10th grave at Thornhill settled under winter rain. Neighbors stopped sending condolences. They began avoiding the estate entirely. Some whispered that God had passed judgment. Others feared whatever had taken root there might spread. Carter's authority had weakened visibly. He no longer hosted gatherings. He no longer laughed. The forced marriage meant to humiliate Elijah now stood as a quiet reminder of the master's cruelty. But cruelty had not produced obedience. It had produced patience. One cold morning, Carter collapsed in the dining room, unable to stand without assistance. He stared at the silverware laid before him, as if it held answers he could not grasp. His hands trembled too much to lift a fork. The doctor stood nearby, helpless and confused. Outside, smoke from the forge rose steadily into pale sky. Elijah paused his hammer for a moment, sensing something had shifted finally beyond return. 7 months had passed since the forced wedding ceremony. 7 months of routine. 7 months of unnoticed access. 7 months of fear growing quietly inside a powerful household. As Carter lay in bed that evening, staring at the ceiling, a thought flickered through his weakened mind for the first time. What if the sickness was not random? What if it had intention? But by then, suspicion had no direction. It could not point clearly toward anyone. It floated like fog over the estate, thick and useless. Elijah stood alone at the forge as dusk settled, watching sparks fade into darkness. He had not led a violent uprising. He had not gathered a mob. He had used something far more difficult: time. And as winter winds swept across Thornhill Plantation, the system that believed itself invincible had been undone not by noise, but by quiet endurance. Yet the story was not finished, because when a powerful family collapses, investigations follow. And somewhere beyond Wilkinson County, someone would eventually begin asking deeper questions. The new year arrived with frost still clinging to Thornhill's fields, but inside the big house the air felt heavy and stale. Samuel Carter lingered between weakness and fear, his body thinner than anyone remembered. Word of the mysterious deaths had traveled beyond Wilkinson County. A distant cousin from Natchez arrived with legal documents and sharp questions. He was not grieving. He was calculating. 10 members of a wealthy household gone in less than a year meant land, property, and money waiting to be claimed. He walked through the halls, studying portraits on the walls, pausing in the dining room longer than necessary. He asked the doctor for records. He asked servants for timelines. And unlike Carter, he did not dismiss the pattern as swamp fever. He looked for something deliberate. The cousin's attention eventually turned toward the routines of the household. Who prepared meals? Who cleaned the silver? Who repaired damaged pieces? Who had access repeatedly over months? The cook was questioned again, this time more aggressively. The kitchen staff were threatened with punishment if they hid information. The overseer defended himself loudly, claiming complete loyalty to Carter. When the cousin asked who maintained the family's silverware and table fittings, a servant answered plainly. The blacksmith. He takes bent pieces to the forge and returns them polished. The cousin's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in accusation yet, but in curiosity. He requested to see the forge. Elijah greeted him with the same calm expression he showed everyone. The forge glowed red against the winter air. Tools hung neatly on the wall. Horseshoes cooled in a row near the anvil. The cousin walked slowly around the space, inspecting shelves and examining scraps of metal. He asked casual questions about Elijah's training. Where did you learn this skill? How long have you worked here? Elijah answered simply, From my father, since I was young. The cousin picked up a polished spoon, resting on a table, and turned it in his hand. Fine work, he muttered. Too fine for plantation use. Elijah met his gaze without challenge. Metal deserves care, he replied. The cousin placed the spoon down slowly. Suspicion had begun, but suspicion without proof is only thought. Back inside the house, Carter grew worse. He drifted between fever and clarity. In his clearer moments, he demanded to know whether his cousin suspected foul play. The cousin avoided direct answer. He spoke instead about securing inheritance rights and stabilizing the estate. In truth, he feared scandal more than crime. If word spread that Thornhill had fallen victim not to disease but to deliberate resistance, the panic across Mississippi would deepen. Already neighboring plantations were tightening control. Already whispers of hidden knowledge and silent retaliation were spreading among enslaved communities. A public accusation without evidence could ignite more fear than 10 graves had. One evening, as frost settled again outside, The cousin gathered remaining white household members for private discussion. He spoke carefully. There may have been contamination in certain objects, he suggested vaguely. Something introduced over time. We may never prove it. The doctor frowned, offended by the implication. Without clear symptoms of common poison, he argued, we cannot name such cause. The cousin remained silent after that. Proof required certainty, and certainty did not exist. Elijah continued working at the forge, as if unaware of the quiet investigation unfolding around him. Yet he noticed the cousin's longer glances. He noticed the increased caution in the kitchen. He noticed silver pieces being replaced more frequently. Patience had carried him through 7 months. Now it would carry him through scrutiny. He did not change routine. He did not show anxiety. Routine is its own disguise. Late one night, Carter's breathing slowed dramatically. The doctor was summoned urgently, but arrived too late. Samuel Carter died before dawn, his final days marked by confusion and fear. The plantation that had once echoed with command now stood under uncertain control. The cousin inherited quickly and quietly. Publicly, the cause remained illness. Privately, doubt lingered like smoke that refused to clear. But without confession, without physical evidence, the truth remained buried beneath 10 graves in winter soil. As spring approached, the cousin made swift changes at Thornhill. Some enslaved workers were sold to distant plantations. Others were reassigned. Elijah was nearly included in the sales list, but his skill was too valuable. The forge remained necessary. Life on the plantation resumed in cautious rhythm, though something fundamental had shifted. The power once displayed so boldly had been shaken. One afternoon, as Elijah hammered iron under bright spring sun, he felt eyes on him again. The cousin stood at a distance, watching, thoughtful. For a long moment their gazes met. The cousin said nothing. He turned and walked away. Some suspicions are dangerous to voice, and so Thornhill Plantation survived, but not unchanged. 10 graves stood as silent testimony to something no doctor could explain. Rumors traveled quietly along the Mississippi. Stories of mysterious illness. Stories of knowledge passed from father to son. Stories of resistance that did not shout but endured. Elijah wiped sweat from his brow and returned to his work. He had not broken chains openly. He had not burned buildings. He had used patience and inheritance. Whether history would ever record his act did not matter. The master who had forced humiliation upon him was gone. The house that had mocked him stood diminished, and somewhere beyond Thornhill, others were listening to whispers, learning that resistance could take many forms. Spring settled fully over Wilkinson County, bringing warm air and new growth to Thornhill Plantation. Fields were replanted. Wagons rolled once more along the main road. From a distance, the estate appeared restored to order. But inside the big house, silence lingered heavier than before. The new owner, Carter's cousin, ruled differently. He spoke less and watched more. He trusted no one easily. He ordered that new silverware be purchased from Natchez, and that old pieces be melted down. He did not say why. The doctor's final report still named illness as cause of death. Yet doubt had rooted itself quietly in his mind. Something unseen had dismantled the powerful household piece by piece, and he could not forget that. Elijah remained at the forge, his role unchanged outwardly. He repaired plows and sharpened tools as usual. The forced marriage that had begun this silent war still bound him publicly, though its humiliation had lost its sting. The overseer's daughter kept distance from the main house now, speaking little, watching much. She understood in ways others did not that the shift at Thornhill had not been accidental. She had seen the quiet resolve in Elijah's eyes months earlier. She had witnessed how routine never faltered, even as coffins multiplied. Yet she said nothing. Silence can protect more than words. Across neighboring plantations, fear moved like wind through tall grass. Masters who once laughed at tales of rebellion now examined their kitchens and workshops more closely. They watched blacksmiths with new suspicion. They demanded food be tasted before serving. They questioned how many objects passed through enslaved hands each day. Some increased punishments out of paranoia. Others tightened supervision around skilled workers. But fear is a strange force. It exposes vulnerability. It reveals how dependent the system truly is on the labor and knowledge of those it enslaves. The story of Thornhill became a quiet warning spoken in hushed tones, not loud enough to confirm, not soft enough to ignore. One evening, months after Carter's burial, the cousin approached the forge again. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the yard. He stood beside Elijah and watched iron glow under flame. "You have skill," he said carefully. "Skill is useful when directed properly." Elijah nodded without speaking. The cousin studied him, searching for cracks in his composure. "I intend to expand operations here," he continued. "I will need loyalty." Elijah lifted the heated iron from the coals and struck it steadily on the anvil. Sparks flew upward like brief stars. "Loyalty," he replied calmly, "is shaped like metal. It depends on how it is treated." The cousin did not respond immediately. He turned away slowly, perhaps unsure whether the words were warning or simple observation. Power had shifted at Thornhill, but control still existed. Elijah understood that survival required balance. His act had dismantled cruelty in one house, but the wider system remained vast and brutal. He would not be reckless now. He would not draw attention beyond what had already passed. Resistance does not always require repetition. Sometimes it requires endurance. As summer approached, the graves at Thornhill settled fully into earth. Grass grew over fresh soil. Visitors stopped asking questions. The estate returned to quiet productivity. But something invisible had changed forever. The illusion that masters were untouchable had cracked. Skilled hands, once underestimated, were now regarded with cautious respect. Even suspicion, though dangerous, acknowledged capability. Elijah stood at the forge one late afternoon, listening to the steady ring of hammer against iron. He thought of his father's quiet lessons about metal and heat. Knowledge survives in places chains cannot reach. It waits patiently for the right moment. He did not seek recognition. He did not seek legend. What he had done would likely never be written in official records. It would remain rumor, carried along the Mississippi in whispers and careful glances. But Thornhill Plantation would never again feel invincible. 10 deaths had carved doubt into its foundation, and doubt is powerful. It weakens arrogance. It unsettles certainty. It forces those who once ruled with cruelty to look over their shoulders. As smoke rose gently from the forge into the wide Mississippi sky, Elijah understood that resistance had many forms. Some loud, some silent, some immediate, some patient. His had been patient, and in patience he had found a weapon sharper than steel. Summer heat settled thick over Wilkinson County, pressing against the fields and slowing every movement beneath the sun. Thornhill Plantation worked as it always had, yet something unseen lingered beneath its routines. The new master walked the grounds daily, observing not only crops, but people, He watched conversations from a distance. He noticed who stood close to whom. He studied faces, as if searching for hidden language. Fear had not left the estate. It had simply grown quieter, and quiet fear is more dangerous than open panic. Elijah sensed the change in atmosphere immediately. Orders were given more carefully. Access to the main house was reduced. Silverware was replaced and stored differently. The cousin did not accuse him openly, but caution followed him like a shadow. Yet Elijah did not alter his rhythm. Each morning he lit the forge. Each afternoon he repaired tools. Each evening he cleaned his workspace thoroughly. Consistency builds invisibility. He knew that any sudden change would draw attention. His survival now depended on appearing exactly as he always had. Across neighboring plantations, rumors continued spreading. Stories traveled along wagon routes and river docks. Some claimed the Thornhill deaths were divine punishment. Others suggested swamp fever. But among enslaved workers, the whispers were different. They spoke of patience, of knowledge carried quietly across oceans, of resistance that did not shout but endured. No one named Elijah directly. No one needed to. The story moved without names, protected by uncertainty. Even free black craftsmen in nearby towns began noticing the shift in how masters treated skilled labor. Suspicion had replaced arrogance. It was subtle, but real. One evening, as the sun dipped low and heat began easing, a stranger arrived at Thornhill, claiming to be a trader passing through. He carried supplies and spoke politely with the cousin. From the forge yard, Elijah observed the man's posture. He was not a simple trader. His boots were too clean, his eyes too searching. He lingered near the house longer than necessary. Later that night, Elijah overheard part of a conversation drifting from the open window of the main hall. The stranger mentioned investigations in other counties. Plantation owners were quietly discussing coordinated measures, increased inspections of skilled workers, secret questioning. The cousin replied cautiously, unwilling to expose weakness publicly. Elijah understood then that Thornhill was not an isolated story anymore. It had become cautionary rumor among the powerful. They would not admit fear openly, but they would adjust their control methods. The system was learning, just as he had learned. Resistance invites reaction. Reaction invites adaptation. The balance never remained still. Days later, the stranger returned briefly to the forge under the excuse of admiring craftsmanship. He asked Elijah casual questions about metal sources and tool repairs. His tone was friendly, but his gaze probed deeper. Elijah answered simply, never offering more than required. The stranger's smile lingered too long before he left. That night, Elijah considered what survival required next. Patience had carried him once. It would need to carry him again. The overseer's daughter approached him quietly after dark, her voice barely above whisper. "They are asking about you in town," she said. "Not directly, but they are listening for stories." Elijah nodded slowly. He had expected this moment. Silence protected him, but silence also limited options. If suspicion solidified, accusation could follow even without proof. Weeks passed without direct confrontation. The stranger did not return. The cousin reduced outside inquiries, perhaps fearing scandal more than truth. Yet, Elijah remained aware that the ground beneath him was less stable than before. Thornhill survived, but under watchful eyes. One late afternoon, as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, Elijah paused at the forge and looked toward the distant road leading north. He understood that staying meant continued caution. Leaving meant uncertainty. His act had shifted power quietly, but it had also placed him within reach of suspicion. The question was no longer whether resistance had succeeded. The question was how long safety could last. As lightning flickered far off across the Mississippi sky, Elijah returned to his work. The hammer fell in steady rhythm. Sparks rose and vanished into evening air. Patience had shaped iron. Patience had shaped fate. Now patience would determine whether he remained at Thornhill or stepped beyond it. And somewhere beyond the fields and river roads, change was moving through the south. Quiet, but unstoppable. Carried by stories that no master could fully silence. The heat of late summer pressed heavily over Thornhill Plantation, but beneath that heat, something colder was moving. The stranger who had once claimed to be a traitor had not returned, yet his visit left a mark. Questions were being asked quietly in Wilkinson County. The cousin no longer walked the yard with the confidence of ownership. He walked with calculation. He had begun keeping written records of tool repairs and kitchen supplies. He had even ordered that certain items be counted at the end of each week. It was subtle, but deliberate. He was searching for patterns, for gaps, for anything that might explain what had already happened. Elijah noticed the changes immediately. The number of utensils sent to the forge was reduced. Repairs were inspected more closely before being returned to the house. The cousin began standing near the doorway when Elijah entered the main hall for maintenance work. Nothing was said directly, but suspicion lingered in the air like humidity before a storm. Elijah did not react. He did not withdraw or rush. He performed his tasks exactly as expected. The best disguise is normalcy. He understood that fear inside the master's house was now permanent. Whether they ever proved anything or not, Thornhill would never again feel untouchable. Beyond the plantation, the story of the mysterious deaths had grown into something larger than rumor. Enslaved workers from nearby estates shared fragments during brief encounters at river crossings and market days. They spoke of a house that fell from within. They spoke of a master who forced humiliation and paid for it slowly. Some added details that were not true. Others removed parts that were. That is how stories survive. They shift. They travel. They adapt. The truth did not need to be exact. It needed only to exist. Elijah heard these whispers occasionally when traveling to repair tools for neighboring farms. He never responded, but he understood the power of narrative. Resistance, once proven possible, spreads quietly. One evening, the cousin called Elijah to the veranda after supper. The air was thick with approaching rain. Cicadas hummed loudly in the trees. The cousin stood with folded arms, studying him in fading light. "Tell me," he said slowly, "do you believe a man can destroy a house without raising a weapon?" The question was not casual. It was careful. Elijah met his gaze calmly. "A house can fall from many causes, sir," he replied. "Weak foundation, hidden rot, neglect." The cousin's jaw tightened slightly, and if someone encouraged that rot, he pressed. Elijah held steady. Then the foundation was already fragile. Silence stretched between them. Thunder rolled in the distance. The cousin looked away first. Without proof, without confession, he had nothing. To accuse openly would invite scandal. To punish without evidence would invite rebellion. Fear restrained him as much as law. Finally, he dismissed Elijah with a curt nod. But the exchange had confirmed something. Suspicion had sharpened. That night, heavy rain fell over Thornhill, washing dust from leaves and cooling parched soil. Elijah stood beneath the shed roof near the forge, listening to water strike earth. He understood that his time at Thornhill was no longer certain. The act that dismantled one master had also altered the balance around him. If the cousin gathered enough doubt, even without proof, sale or relocation could follow. And relocation meant loss of control. Patience would not protect him forever, in a place where eyes watched closely. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air clear and sharp. Elijah made a decision quietly, without announcement. He would prepare. Not for violence, not for immediate escape, but for movement when the moment arrived. He began setting aside small necessities. A wrapped cloth hidden beneath loose boards in the forge. A sharpened blade tucked discreetly where it would not be easily discovered. He watched river traffic more closely when wagons passed. He listened for talk of northern routes, whispered among travelers. The plantation continued operating as usual, but tension remained coiled beneath its surface. The cousin reduced his visits to the forge, yet increased oversight of other areas. Trust no longer existed fully in that household, and once trust fractures, control weakens. Elijah returned to his hammer and anvil as always, sparks rising with each strike. To an observer, he was still the quiet blacksmith shaping iron, but inside, he was shaping possibility. Thornhill had changed because of him. Whether he stayed or left, the mark remained. 10 graves stood as silent witness, and somewhere beyond Wilkinson County, the idea that resistance could be patient and intelligent continued spreading like roots beneath the soil, unseen but powerful. The question now was not whether suspicion would return. It was when. And when it did, Elijah intended to be ready. Autumn returned to Wilkinson County, with cooler air and restless winds. The cotton fields turned pale under the sun, ready for harvest again. Thornhill Plantation looked strong from a distance, yet beneath its surface, a quiet instability remained. The cousin had settled into ownership, but not into comfort. He had inherited land and profit, yet also doubt. Every time he passed the row of 10 graves beyond the tree line, something tightened in his chest. Illness could be accepted, accident could be forgiven, but deliberate undoing, if proven, would mean weakness in his bloodline, and weakness was unacceptable. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Natchez, sealed with careful handwriting. The cousin read it privately inside his study. It contained inquiries from other plantation owners who had experienced minor illnesses within their own households. Nothing fatal, nothing confirmed, but enough to stir anxiety. They asked whether Thornhill had discovered any cause, whether the sickness had been traced to water or food or outside influence. The cousin's reply was brief and guarded. He wrote that doctors had concluded natural causes. He wrote that no evidence of foul play had been found. But his hand trembled slightly as he sealed the envelope. The fear he wished to contain was spreading beyond his property. Elijah sensed the shift again. The cousin's glances were sharper. Questions from neighboring estates had increased. The story of Thornhill had grown into something more than rumor. It had become a caution, carried by silence. The overseer's daughter approached Elijah quietly one evening near the barn. "They will never forget what happened," she whispered, "even if they cannot prove it." Elijah nodded once. He understood. Proof was not necessary to change behavior. Suspicion alone had altered how masters viewed their own security. That was power, even if unnamed. As harvest began, Elijah worked longer hours repairing tools dulled by constant cutting. He listened as field hands whispered of new restrictions imposed across the county. Masters inspecting kitchens personally, blacksmiths being monitored more closely. Some skilled workers transferred unexpectedly to distant plantations. The system was adjusting. It had felt a crack, and now sought reinforcement. Elijah knew his window for remaining unnoticed was narrowing. Patience had served him once. Now it required movement. Late one night, under a sky thick with stars, Elijah returned to the forge alone. He removed the loose board beneath the workbench and retrieved the small cloth bundle he had prepared weeks earlier. Inside were simple provisions and a folded scrap of paper given months before by a passing river worker. A name written carefully. A contact upriver who might offer passage north. He held the paper in his hands and listened to the distant sound of the Mississippi moving through darkness. The river had carried many stories. Perhaps it could carry him too. The next morning, before dawn light reached the fields, Elijah walked the perimeter of Thornhill one final time. He paused near the graves, not in regret, but in recognition. What had happened there had reshaped the plantation without open rebellion. 10 lives lost, one household undone, and a lesson etched into Mississippi soil. He did not seek more destruction. He sought survival and distance. The cousin might never accuse him openly, but suspicion would never fully disappear, and suspicion can become danger without warning. Before sunrise, he returned to the forge and completed a final task, leaving tools arranged exactly as expected. He did not want his departure discovered too soon. Then, moving quietly through tree lines instead of open road, Elijah stepped beyond Thornhill's boundary. He carried no weapon in his hand, no banner, no declaration, only knowledge, patience, and a direction northward along the river. By mid-morning, the plantation would notice his absence. The cousin would send riders. Questions would sharpen into search. But Elijah had chosen his moment carefully. Just after harvest began, when attention was divided and oversight strained, he moved steadily toward the Mississippi, avoiding main paths and crossing shallow creeks to scatter tracks. The river glimmered ahead under rising sun. Behind him, Thornhill Plantation stood intact yet forever altered. The cousin would continue ruling cautiously. The story of mysterious deaths would never fully fade. Some would call it disease. Some would whisper about inherited knowledge and silent resistance. Official records would remain vague, but among those who listened carefully, the truth would survive in fragments. As Elijah reached the riverbank and watched a small supply boat drifting north, he felt neither triumph nor fear, only movement. The act that had reshaped Thornhill was complete. Now, survival required distance. He stepped toward the water's edge, ready to trade one chapter of resistance for another unknown horizon. The South would continue enforcing chains. Masters would tighten control. But they would also remember Thornhill. They would remember that power built on cruelty can rot from within. And somewhere along the Mississippi, carried by quiet voices and careful memory, the story of the blacksmith who used patience instead of noise would continue traveling far beyond the plantation that once believed itself invincible.